Hello, everybody. I want to talk to you guys about the ancientness of Nazism. The ancientness of Nazism. You say, well, Ted, that is very strange. Nazism is an ideology that took over Germany in the 1930s. How could you say that it was ancient? I mean, they are people who are alive today who lived through that most dark and horrid era. How could you call it ancient? Well, Hitler came from Austria, did he not? He was Austrian, and he subscribed to the ideology of eugenics. And he also subscribed to the ideology of blood and soil. The reverence for the land, the reverence, the worship. Reverence is a light word. Reverence is like, oh yeah, this person reveres his country or something like that. Oh, he reveres his father or something like that. Revere is not necessarily like worshiping something as deity. No, Hitler worshipped race, or at least the ideology that he was pushing demanded the worship of race, because when you are willing to kill and to fight and to exterminate other people for your race, you worship your race. That which you are willing to kill for is something that you either adore heavily or something that you worship. And Nazism was all about worshiping race. And it was also in that context of worshiping race, there was this idea of purging the race of certain undesirables, people who were members of your nation, but they had certain physical traits and characteristics that you believed brought down your race, made your race look ugly, made your race look monstrous in your eyes. And this was the extermination of those who were mentally handicapped, physically handicapped, people who were born with certain deformities. These people were seen as a blight to the people, a blight to the Volk. And so they needed to be gotten rid of. Well, I'm reading this book right now. It's called Dying for the Gods. Dying for the Gods by some English woman. Her name is Miranda Aldhouse Green. If you look her name up, you'll find her talking on YouTube for I'm pretty certain the BBC about the ancient world and all that stuff. But I mean, she's obviously quite informed and knowledgeable about the subject. And this book is about human sacrifice in ancient Europe, which is a very, very fascinating topic, because it's not something that's talked about very much when it comes to human sacrifice. Probably the civilization that comes up the most is the Aztec civilization, because the Aztec civilization went really full throttle with human sacrifice. I mean, it came to the point where they had all these pyramids, and on each pyramid, they were sacrificing around 2,000 people in one day. I mean, that's how bad and horrific it was. It was pretty damn sinister. Now, when it comes to human sacrifice in Europe, this is not something that's talked about so much. Perhaps because we don't have as much archaeological we don't have as much of an archaeological record about human sacrifice in Europe as we do in Mexico, but nonetheless, it did exist. Probably a lot more than people think. And so in this book, she talks about this archaeological discovery that was made in the 1990s. It was made in October of 1997 in Austria, the land of Hitler. And it says here that these archaeologists discovered basically a pit with about a dozen bodies, and these people were burned. This is what the investigation concluded, that these people were burned, the bodies were burned, and looking at the skeletal remains, looking at specifically the jawbones of these people, they concluded that these people all had physical deformities on their jaws, leading them to have speech impediments. Now, this site is believed to be as old as 200 years before Christ. It's been estimated to be as old as circa 200 BC, which is pretty ancient. We're talking thousands of years ago. We're not talking about, the emperor Augustus or something like that. We're talking about something very ancient, far into antiquity. I mean, the Romans were ancient, don't get me wrong, but this is extremely ancient. We're talking like probably not too long after the Indo-European migration. Well, probably earlier than that, but not too far off, right? Probably at least closer to the culture of those Indo-European peoples who migrated into Europe from Anatolia, the Caucasus. But in this book, it says, in October 1997, archaeologists working at the Austrian town of Leonding excavated a deep pit dating to circa 200 BC, containing the remains of humans and animals, all apparently subjected to burning. Skeletal analysis revealed that all 12 people had suffered from the same hereditary deformity of their jawbones, causing severe speech impediments. The site has been interpreted as the focus of a grisly sacrificial ritual. This was a brutal murder, repeated 3 times every 2 or 3 years. And we probably don't even know if that's accurate. They could have done this every year. When you burn bodies, a lot of times the skeletons dissipate. So it's very difficult to find archaeological remains of an immolation, archaeological remains of someone who was ritually burned to death, because fire destroys the whole body. It reduces the body into ashes. In which humans and beasts were tethered. Now, this is very, very brutal. The humans and the beasts were tethered to a wooden device suspended above the pit, which was then set on fire, so that the entire edifice with its hapless victims collapsed into the hole. So kind of like what the ancient Gauls used to do. They would, according to Julius Caesar, they would put a whole bunch of humans into a giant wooden image of a human, and they would set it on fire. And all these people inside the statue, inside the wooden image, inside the wooden statue, would be burned to death for the god of thunder and lightning that the Gauls worshipped. And I just want to read to you guys the quote from Julius Caesar. This is really fascinating. The book includes the quote. It says here, and I'll just say this quote, give my commentary, and I'll add something more about the Austrian human sacrifice. But it says here that the Gauls believe the power of the immortal gods can be appeased only if one human life is exchanged for another. And they have sacrifices of this kind regularly established by the community. Some of them have enormous images made of wicker works, hence the word the wicker man, the limbs of which they fill with living men. These are set on fire, and the men perish, enveloped in the flames. Absolutely horrific, absolutely brutal, but it makes you wonder how human beings came to this level. Here's another image that I want to show you guys here. I don't know if... try to get the camera to focus on this. But you can see, this is from ancient Greece. It's a girl being held from both sides of her body, and a blade is placed into her throat, and the blood is draining out from her neck, like sacrificing a sheep in the Old Testament, but it's a human being. And in the book, it says here that this image from Greece is a mythical human sacrificial scene on a 6th century BC Greek vase painting. Polyxena, royal daughter of the Trojan king Priam and Hecuba. Those ancient Greek names, some of them sound very African. Like King Agamemnon. It sounds Egyptian. So the daughter of this king is sacrificed by Neoptolemos at the tomb of Achilles. And there was human sacrifice in the ancient Greek world. There was human sacrifice in ancient Europe. This is obvious. But going back to the Austrian discovery, the sacrificial ritual that was undug, excavated in Austria back in the 90s, they found 12 bodies. These people were burned, and they all had the same exact deformity. All of them, the same exact deformity. That's not coincidental, right? This is not a case of, oh, yeah, these people just died and they buried them and then they burned the bodies, right? They cremated them. The fact that they have animals in the pit, the fact that they have this wooden structure, the remnant of this wooden structure in the pit, the fact that these people were burned in the ancient world, in far antiquity, burning a sacrifice was very, very common. And when you see bodies in one area and they were lit on fire, they were burned, and they all have the same exact condition, that is not coincidental. These people were picked out, and the fact that they all have the same deformity tells me that in ancient Austria, some German guy was saying, the people with the deformities, yeah, they should be the ones sacrificed to the gods. Yeah, sacrificed to the god. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. 200 BC, everybody. They were picking people out because they had deformities and killing them for their pagan gods. Nazism is very, very ancient. It's extremely ancient. The land where Hitler was born, the land that spawned the man who would legislate and who would impose a law of exterminating people with deformities. In that very land, 200 BC, people were saying the same damn thing, which goes to show you that line from Solomon the Wise is very true. There is nothing new under the sun. Nothing new. And when you look at the ancient world, there are things about the ancient world that we know very little of. We do have some knowledge here and there. When you talk about the ancient Roman Empire, we have an abundance of information just merely from the fact that the Romans were very good at documenting things. Same thing with the ancient Greek world. Same thing with the ancient Egyptian world. We have a lot of information, a lot of material because these ancient peoples documented events. When it comes to things like ancient Germany and the Netherlands, those ancient Germanic peoples, we don't have a whole lot of information because they didn't document a lot of stuff. Either that or a lot of the stuff was destroyed. And when you look at the ancient world, what you find is this idea of spilling blood for appealing the gods. And I believe wholeheartedly that human sacrifice, be it in ancient Europe, be it in ancient Egypt, Roman Empire, the Greek world, Aztecs, human sacrifice was the result of a corruption of God's teaching. When you look at the Bible, the ark crashes in Anatolia, right in the Caucasus Mountains somewhere, Mount Ararat, basically right on the border between Turkey and Armenia. And Noah and his family exit the ark. Noah does a sacrifice. He sheds the blood of an animal to appeal to God, to appease God, right? To gain atonement. It's an atonement sacrifice. And God's nostrils smelled the aroma of the sacrifice, and he was very pleased. In the book of Genesis, this is the type of word that it uses, right? That God smelled the sacrifice, the aroma of the sacrifice, which is very fascinating. That the Bible would use this sort of word, or these sorts of words. And Noah had sons. He had 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Noah was a priest, as St. Peter tells us, and Noah obviously taught his kids about sacrifice. You have to sacrifice an animal for atonement. You have to sacrifice an animal to please God. So that ritual of sacrificing animals continued on into thousands of years of history. Be it in Africa, be it in Europe, be it in the Middle East, there was sacrifice. You can go into any ancient civilization, you find sacrifice. And the ancient Europeans, even in this archaeological dig in Austria, they found humans and animals. So they were obviously sacrificing animals. This is something that was taught by Noah. It was done through Noah. And somewhere along the line, human beings began to kill other humans as sacrifices. Somewhere along the line. How did this happen? I have a theory how this happened, right? How do you go from, well, we got to sacrifice lambs and goats to please God for atonement? How do you go from that to, well, we got to kill some humans too? I really believe that in far, far antiquity, probably taught by Noah himself, humans knew that a Messiah was coming. There's even a quote from Plato. I can't quote it verbatim, but Plato said something to the likes of, pretty certain it was Plato who said this, that in the future a man will come from the east and he will be so perfect that he will be crucified. And yes, the word crucified is used in this ancient quote. So in the ancient world, they knew that a Messiah was going to come, right? That there was going to be a Redeemer. Because you think, oh, that was only taught to the ancient Israelites. I don't believe that. For one, the oldest book in the Bible that we have is not even Hebrew. It's not. It's Arabic. It's the book of Job. Job was an Arab. He was from I think he was pretty certain he was either a Moabite or an Edomite. He was living in ancient Jordan, which is Arabia. And Job, of course, understood sacrifice. Job understood God. He had this direct relationship with God. And he was an Arab. And when Moses went down, when Moses killed the Egyptian and he fled, he meets up with who? He meets up with Jethro. And how does the Bible describe Jethro? As a priest of God. Was Jethro a Hebrew? No. Jethro was an Arab. So there were ancient peoples who had knowledge of God before the establishment of ancient Israel. Before that establishment. Before the Levitical priesthood, before the Mosaic covenant, before King David and King Solomon, people already knew about God. That knowledge got corrupted into paganism, but there are even certain instances when that knowledge of the one true God still remains. We see this in the New Testament when St. Paul goes to the Athenians and he says, you have this altar to the unknown God. Well, I am here to preach to you who that unknown God is. They had a knowledge of God, but they lost a lot of the zeal and the passion. They lost that for the true God. And they revered and they adored false gods and heroes like Hercules and Zeus. And they began to worship other humans and worship Caesars and emperors. And they were pagans. Even when you read, for example, Homer, when you read the poetry of Homer, the English translations of those ancient poems will say, it'll render certain lines as mentioning God, mentioning this one God. Now they could have called this one God Deus or Zeus, but still they had this idea of one God who was the creator. They had all these other gods. And you see this in the Old Testament as well. After the children of Israel get out of Egypt and Jethro is still with Moses, Jethro tells Moses, now I know who the true God is. Now I know that this is the true God. So he had a knowledge of God, but he also had this belief in other gods. And seeing the miracles that were done for the children of Israel, he realized there's only one God. There's only one true God here. That's it. And so in the ancient world, they had a knowledge of God. And that was because of the teachings of Noah to his 3 sons. That knowledge of God was passed down. Somewhere along the line, it got corrupted. Even St. Paul talks about this in the letter to the Romans. He says, he talks about how people had a knowledge of God, but then they began to worship the creation. They began to worship nature. They began to worship other humans, emperors, kings, heroes. Somewhere along the line, this happened. We don't know exactly when. We have some idea. Obviously, this happened before the flood. God destroyed all of humanity with the exception of Noah and his family. They exit the ark. They start doing sacrifices. And eventually, humans go back to paganism. Didn't take very long because not too long, there was the Tower of Babel. Didn't take that long for people to come up with the idea. Of the Tower of Babel. And there's a verse in the Old Testament that says life is in the blood. That's why you sacrifice animals, because you're giving up a life to gain atonement. A life must be sacrificed for salvation. This was ultimately fulfilled by Jesus Christ in the crucifixion. But I believe in the ancient world, they had this knowledge that some Messiah was going to come, right? And they said a Messiah will come and he will be sacrificed for the sins of mankind. I would not doubt this was taught by Noah himself. And then, this is my theory, somewhere along the line, at some point, people began to say, well, actually, no, that's all false. A human being must be sacrificed for the sins of man. A human being must be sacrificed to please the gods. That Messiah... No. We are our own Messiah. We are our own Christ. And you see this in ancient human sacrifice. The Aztecs killed so many people. Why? To appease the gods. Humans must be killed. The ancient Romans, they had the gladiatorial games, which have their origins in human sacrifice. Make no mistake. You can look at the history of the gladiatorial matches. It all sprang from human sacrifice. That's a fact. Tertullian talks about this in his work. And the Romans began to continue this ritual through the platform of a spectacle. It became an entertainment. But nonetheless, there was still a belief that these games, as they called them, were pleasing to the gods. And when the Christians would not go to these games, the pagan masses would get very upset. They would say, why aren't you coming to the games? Don't you know that they please the gods? Tertullian talks about this sort of stuff. So in the Aztec world, it was you take a human being and you pluck his heart out and you eat his body. That's what they used to do. It was pretty horrific. And they also did something else that was really sick. They would do this thing once a year to symbolize the coming spring. They would take a human being, skin him, and then a priest would wear the skin like the godskin apostles in Elden Ring and would sit in the temple for like a month or something. And this was supposed to represent the transition to the spring season. It's pretty sick stuff. In the ancient Roman world, it was the gladiatorial matches. That was a form of human sacrifice. That was done as a way to please the gods. It was also done as a way to control the masses with entertainment. And that was considered entertainment in those days. In the ancient Germanic world, there was the idea of killing a human being and putting his body in a bog. A bog is essentially a swamp, and there's something with the waters of a bog that preserve a body, and that's why archaeologists have found numerous bodies like this one, which is, this body is thousands of years old. They found this in Denmark. This is the infamous bog man. And you can see the wrinkles on his forehead. You can see the lines on his body. You can see his muscles. You can see you can see the sinewy nature of his corpse. And it's very well preserved. And this gives us an idea. It's a very clear, dramatic, impactful image of the horror of human sacrifice. I mean, this human being, I think he had his throat slit and they put his body in a bog. And we found numerous examples of this. We found bodies in Northern Europe that have obvious signs of brutal violence inflicted upon it. Fractures to the skull, deep wounds on the neck, that sort of thing. I mean, these were brutal, horrific murders that were done for demons. I mean, they say the gods. As the Bible says, these are not gods, they are demons. But this all came as a result of a corruption of what God taught. God taught the ancient world to sacrifice animals, and at some point they began to sacrifice humans. I believe this was the result of people saying things like, there is going to be no coming Messiah. We are our own Messiah. Our society is a Messiah. The nation is a Messiah. We must sacrifice human beings to appease the gods. And Nazism was just a giant revival of paganism in many ways. Yes, there were Catholics who were Nazis, there were Protestants who were Nazis, but there was a lot of pagan elements in it. That's why you'll hear about how, I think right before the Third Reich came to power, and during the era of the Third Reich, there were people having pagan weddings, and they were into Thor and Thor's hammer and all this crap. There was a lot of paganism in the Nazi world. And in the Nazi world, there was the idea that people with deformities must be gotten rid of. And in 200 BC, there were people in Austria, Germans, ancient Germans, saying the people with deformities need to be the sacrificial victims for the gods. Now, I almost forgot to mention an example from Elden Ring. In one of my last videos, I talked about how I brought up something from the video game Elden Ring, how you can choose to be a samurai in Elden Ring, and I used that as an example, or I used that as a metaphor for Japan choosing the road, choosing the path of the samurai. And I said, why the hell am I talking about a video game, in conjunction with such a serious matter? Somebody in the comments, you know who you are, Kovteo, the Romanian, said. Taking metaphors from video games for serious current events is exactly what I signed up for. So I have another example from Elden Ring, and this one is in regards to human sacrifice, because if you play the video game Elden Ring, you'll see that there is human sacrifice in the game. When you first start the game Elden Ring, and the guys who made Elden Ring, they obviously did their research on ancient European paganism. I mean, and really the ancient European world in general. When you go to Leyendell, the city is obviously modeled after ancient Rome. And then when you go just around the game and you read the lore and you read about like the religion of Elden Ring, obviously they take some things from Christianity, but it's quite clear that they take things from ancient European paganism as well. And there is human sacrifice in Elden Ring. When you first start the game, you meet this masked man who has sort of the mask of the king from the Kingdom of Heaven, the movie The Kingdom of Heaven. And he says, something like, I see that you are here, to become Elden Lord or something like that. And he says, but I'm afraid that you are maidenless, basically calling you a virgin. And then he says you need a maiden, but he doesn't really explain why exactly you need a maiden. And then as you continue his quest line, he starts to explain to you what he needs in a maiden, what he needs in a virgin woman. And he basically tells you that you need to go out and find yourself a maiden, a virgin woman, and kill her as a sacrifice for the Lord of Blood, Mog. I mean, this is in the video game Elden Ring. It's pretty horrific. And the name of this character is Vare, the White Mask. And a lot of people who play the game find him to be very articulate and interesting, but the reality is that I think he's the most evilest character that you meet in the game. He's purely sinister. I killed him when I first met him, so I actually never did his quest line, but I did see it on YouTube. But in Elden Ring, there is human sacrifice, and they obviously took it from an historical reality, which is human sacrifice in ancient Europe. Right now, it is New Year's Eve. We got a few hours before midnight. If you're in Australia, it's already 2023. Congratulations. You are now a little bit deeper into this decade of suck. I don't know if you can hear this, but there are fireworks that are going off as I speak. And you may be asking, Ted, why the hell are you talking about ancient European human sacrifice in the middle of New Year's Eve? Why? Well, for one, I got nothing else better to do. I've been reading this book, and I really want to share this knowledge with you guys. I find it very fascinating. But also because as we go into the future, we are getting more and more paganistic. And when we become more and more paganistic, we become more and more open to ideas that murdered this man right here. And this is a warning. That's what I'm doing here. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless. And have a happy new year.
για τους πλούσιους με τους πολλούς παράδες, τη μαύρη τη φτωχολογιά που ζουν οι φουκαράδες. Έχουν κρασί να πίνουνε, κλαρίνα να βαράνε και κορίτσια όμορφα μαζί τους να γελάνε. Αν θέλετε να μάθετε εσείς που με ρωτάτε, διαβάτε εσείς για άνθρωποι αυτού που περπατάτε. Δόξες και λεφτά εδώ παιδιά μου δεν περνάνε, όσοι έχουνε καλή καρδιά αυτοί καλό περνάνε. Τα λεφτά τα χρήματα στον άδει δεν περνάνε, σαν τους θα τα αφήσετε και θα σας βλαστημάν. Ζαλίζομαι, ζαλίζομαι όταν εσύ συλλογίζομαι, λέει. Ζαλιάρικο, ζαλιάρικο, μικρό και σκανδαλιάρικο. Μωρέ